And guys, we're just going to pause a bit longer and wait for the room to get populated here, and then I'll start. Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to P&P Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. And here with us this evening is attorney and legal commentator, Elie Honig, to talk about his new book, Hatchet Man, How Bill Barr Broke the Prosecutor's Code and Corrupted the Justice Department. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To post a question at any point, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of Hatchet Man. Now, the key thing to know about Elie, the aspect of his background that he highlights in his book, is his experience as a prosecutor. He served 14 years as one, first at the federal level in the Southern District of New York from 2004 to 2012, and at the state level in the New Jersey Division of Criminal Justice from 2012 to 2016. These days, he serves as a legal analyst for CNN, writes columns and hosts a podcast, and he works as special counsel at a law firm, Lowenstein Sandler, advising on investigations and trial strategy. But it's his time as a prosecutor that he draws on for his book, using stories from that period to highlight lessons that he learned about the norms and principles of law enforcement, lessons that he says Bill Barr himself would and should have learned had he ever been a prosecutor. To say Elie has a low regard for how Bill Barr performed as Attorney General under Donald Trump is, well, an understatement. Elie excoriates Barr for a range of sins, charging him with lying, acting as a political partisan, and imposing his own legal and philosophical views on how civil society ought to function. And that's just in the opening pages of Hatchet Man. Publishers Weekly called the book a comprehensive indictment of Barr's tenure as America's top law enforcement official. And a review in Kirkus described the book as a damning, convincing account. But on a more forward-looking note, Elie concludes his book with suggestions for post-Barr reform, which I'm sure he'll get to in a minute. Elie will be in conversation this evening with Omar Jimenez, a CNN correspondent based in Chicago. So Elie and Omar, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Brad. I appreciate it. Elie, great to see you. As always, I feel like we've seen each other so much in this virtual setting. We've got to set up an in-person at some point.
Thank you, Brad, for hosting us. Omar, thank you for agreeing to do this. You're right. We've somehow never met in person, but we've become fast friends through you covering events and me commentating on it and us furiously texting. What are you hearing? What do you think of this? So thank you for agreeing to do this. And I asked you to do it because I really think you're such a talented young reporter, and you've spoken to my classes and you connect so well with them. So thanks for doing that.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me. For everyone that's here, I'm excited for this conversation, mainly because it's rare that you have a book that, of course, is a text cover to cover, but also continues into the world as we move forward. It is very relevant. In the news cycle now, Bill Barr continues to make headlines even after his time as Attorney General and after Elie's finished this great book, Hatchet Man. There we go, right there.
Hang on, wait.
Oh,
there you go.
Matching copies. I love it. I love it. So one of the things I want to start with, though, has to do less with the news cycle and more about the style and the approach that you had in telling this story. I mean, a lot of it is woven between anecdotes of your time as a prosecutor. Some makes me want to be a prosecutor. Very exciting anecdotes, but mainly about how lessons you learned as a prosecutor were blatantly disregarded, you wrote, in Bill Barr's performance as Attorney General. So tell me, where did the idea come from to tell this story in the manner that you did?
So I'll take credit for that particular approach, which I'll tell you candidly, I guess people here are interested in the publishing industry. HarperCollins came to me and asked me, because from seeing me on CNN and reading things I wrote, said, we think you'd be a good person to write this book about what Bill Barr has done at the Justice Department. And I said to them fairly early on, the way I'd like to do it is by telling stories, vignettes from my time as a prosecutor and lessons I learned, and then drawing out the principle, what I call the prosecutor's code, and then applying that to one of the many Bill Barr scandals. And my editor, who's demanding, at first said, all right, write up a couple of chapters. Let me see how that looks. And I sent him the first few chapters and he responded a day later, like one sentence, he said, or two sentences, I blanking love it. Keep on doing what you're doing. And the reason I do it this way is two reasons. First of all, I think it's entertaining. I think people really are fascinated with what do prosecutors really do? What happens behind closed doors of the fabled Southern District of New York? And I tell a lot of those stories about my trials, my mafia prosecutions, that kind of thing. But the other thing is, it really serves to underscore one of the fundamental points that I make in the book, which is Bill Barr, little trivia question, is one of only two people in United States history ever to serve as Attorney General twice. The first one was in the 1800s. Barr was, of course, AG, Omar, probably before you were born, in 1991 to 1993, under George H.W. Bush. And then he did it again 25 years later. But the man never tried a case as a prosecutor. He never worked in a U.S. attorney's office. He never had that upbringing that I had, where the values, the core values of the Justice Department, which we'll talk about, what I call the prosecutor's code, foremost meaning you never lie or stretch the truth. Your credibility is everything. And the other thing is your political independence can never be sacrificed. Bill Barr never learned those lessons. He never internalized those lessons. He was never made to learn them. And so when he became AG, he trashed those norms. He trashed those principles. And that's a big part of what inspired me to write this book. So I thought that I could make it more sort of real and tangible for the reader if I did it that way.
Yeah, I mean, and I can just tell you, as someone who is not from a prosecutorial background, it was very, very interesting and compelling. And, you know, I've learned so many terms. I feel like we're just thrown around in U.S. attorneys' offices. But one of my favorite sort of prosecutor code crossovers, so to speak, came from the Know Your Role chapter. And I was just going to read a little bit of it.
Sure.
Specifically because, and I texted you about this, was because the premise of that was about when a body was being dug up in Agawam, Massachusetts?
Agawam, Massachusetts, correct.
Agawam.
Yes.
Sorry to my Agawamites who might be watching. But it was about the fact that it seems like an exciting thing to do, that you got someone to flip and tell you the location of a body that had been buried for years, but you knew your role as a prosecutor. And you wrote specifically that a good prosecutor knows to resist that impulse. You're not a cop. You're not an FBI agent. You're not a forensic anthropologist. You're a prosecutor. Know your role. William Barr never learned that lesson. And then you go on to exemplify that in what happened in Lafayette Park in DC when protesters were cleared out. So tell me about that dynamic, that relationship in particular, why you felt that relationship was so strong, and why you felt Bill Barr never learned that lesson as you did in Agawam.
So the Agawam story, basically, it's a mafia case that I prosecuted where we charged a bunch of guys with a murder in Springfield, Massachusetts, next town over, famously home of the Basketball Hall of Fame, if anyone's ever been there. Omar, I know you played in college. I'm not sure. Did you ever get? No,
yeah.
But they did a murder in Springfield that we charged a bunch of them for. One of these mob guys then cooperates, and comes in and tells us, and I write about this in the book, I guess, I don't know if I want to give this away, but he says, we killed someone else too, by the way, 7 years ago. And he gives us the name, and I don't know who that is, but the FBI agents say, oh my God, that guy's been missing 7 years. And this cooperator says, yeah, we buried him in the woods. I can show you where. And so we had to get a dig team ready, right? FBI dig team with the jackets and the backhoe. And me and the other prosecutors are like, we should go. Like, we wanted to go because it sounded so exciting, but we knew in our heart of hearts that it's the wrong thing for a prosecutor to do for a variety of reasons. But probably the most important is you can make yourself a witness. If you're at a crime scene and you see something and then you're off the case, it's just bad practice. I know they do it in TV shows. The prosecutor's there at the murder scene. Real prosecutors don't do that. And you have to know your role. And you do have a lot of power as a prosecutor, but you're not an FBI agent. You're not a forensic expert. And so we did the right thing there. We sort of laid back in New York. I'll leave it to suspense whether they found the body or not. Bill Barr, everyone remembers this incident, I think, at Lafayette Park, almost exactly a year ago now, when there were protests happening around the country and there were protesters outside the White House. And you probably remember this scene where Bill Barr, sort of dressed like I am now, like tie, like business casual, no tie, walks out onto the White House lawn after a meeting with the White House and gives an order to somebody, whispers this video of this, says something to one of the commanders, and then they clear out the place using all sorts of over-the-top force and pepper spray and worse on the assembled crowd. And my criticism of Bill Barr there is that's beyond his area of expertise. That's outside of his role. Yes, he's the attorney general. Yes, he has the power to order these guys to do whatever he wants, but he overstepped there. He was really playing general. I mean, I poke fun at him lightly because he is a military buff. And by the way, that immediately after that, Donald Trump walks across the just cleared area to the church and Bill Barr walks with him. Now, there's been a report that's come out since then, a couple weeks ago, where the Department of the Interior said, well, this wasn't planned to clear the way for Donald Trump. However, what that report does do is tie Bill Barr directly to the order to clear the place. So Bill Barr, some people have said, oh, that exonerates him. Not at all. Not if you read the report. In fact, the report says what Bill Barr said to that person was, are these people still going to be here when the president comes out in a couple minutes? Which when the attorney general says it like that, and when the clearing immediately follows and then the president walks through the cleared track, I think it's fair to blame him for that. So that's sort of a one of the lesser remembered, I think, anecdotes, but it to me, it exemplifies the arrogance of Bill Barr and his lack of humility, which I talk about a lot, because he never had to go through the learning process, sometimes painful learning and growing process that I had to, that I talk about in the book.
And one of the things I think that strikes me, not just from reading the book, but also drawing parallels to the real world, is that we're in the midst of sort of this information battle, right? There's always been narratives in politics. Let's not pretend that's new, but really concerted efforts to throw off what should be plain information. I think you laid it out maybe no more succinctly than in the part where you talked about the Mueller report. And I mean, obviously, who could forget this chapter in American history, but especially DC history and in regards to politics, and specifically talking about the comparisons between the Mueller report and the Bill Barr 4-page summary that came out after that. And I just want to read a tiny quote of how you described that, because you described it as a powerfully dishonest and manipulative document. History should remember it as the moment when he first subordinated the Justice Department to the president's needs. Why did this moment stick out in your mind as that, again, first subordination?
This was really Bill Barr's original sin, in my view. The crazy thing is he told us all what he was going to do, because you remember before his nomination, about 5 months before, when it became obvious Jeff Sessions was going to get tossed out, which he did after the midterms, Bill Barr sent in what we call the audition memo, an unsolicited 19-page memo where he lays out, and it gets to the Justice Department, and we now know it got to the White House, why Robert Mueller's investigation, in Bill Barr's view, is, and I quote, fatally misconceived. Okay, so fatally means dead. So Bill Barr is telling us all in advance, I'm going to kill this case, and that's exactly what he did. Now, the way he did it was so devious and so dishonest and so manipulative. So the timeline. Bill Barr is basically the first person outside of Mueller's team to get the Mueller report. He gets it on a Friday night. I still remember the panic at CNN when we understood this was happening, March 22nd. 2 days later, Sunday night, March 24th, Bill Barr issues a 4-page letter summarizing the principal conclusions. He and his supporters say it wasn't a summary, like as if that helps him. You can call it whatever you want. It's a 4-page accounting of the Mueller report, and it's so powerfully dishonest. He leaves out all the stuff about how Russia, he even actually in one instance, Bill Barr cuts a sentence in half, and he leaves in the back half of the sentence, which says there's no chargeable federal crime here, but he cuts out the first half of the sentence, which essentially is Mueller finding Russia committed crimes to interfere in 2016. They did it because they wanted Trump to win. The Trump campaign knew about this and expected to benefit from it, and had dozens and dozens of contacts where they were trying to coordinate and facilitate on it. So that is powerfully dishonest. To take out the although and to only give us the back half is is something that any judge, if I ever tried that as a prosecutor, a judge would tear my head off, rightly so. That would be outrageous. You would be disciplined, maybe even honestly fired if you tried that as a prosecutor. And then Bill Barr, now I fault Mueller for not stating clearly on obstruction of justice. Mueller gave us all the evidence on obstruction, but he never said, and therefore I find it's obstruction. He said, well, he's the president. Under our policy, I can't charge him, and I wouldn't want to sully his reputation, so I'll leave it to others. Bill Barr then gleefully jumped into that fray and said, well, he left it to me, so I declare no obstruction. To this day, by the way, Bill Barr has never substantively defended that determination. I became one of 2,000 former prosecutors who served under both parties to say there absolutely is obstruction here, and Barr got that wrong. I've never seen a letter from 2,000 or 20 other prosecutors saying the opposite. And then here's the thing that people may forget that's so manipulative, so deceptive. Bill Barr took 2 days to quote unquote read the whole 448-page report, which I'm dubious of. And then do you remember how long Bill Barr held on to that report and kept it away from the public and Congress? 27 days. And during that key 27-day period, the whole narrative was gone. Trump said, I'm exonerated. All of Trump's followers said he's exonerated, no collusion, no obstruction. And by the time the thing came out 27 days later, everyone's opinions were already crystallized. And his reason for withholding it was he said he had to redact it, meaning cross out classified info. I've done this. It takes a little bit of time, but when you're the AG and you can command the entire power of DOJ, you should get that done in a week max. And by the way, a federal judge later found that it was a bogus pretext and he didn't even redact it properly in the first place. That's so manipulative. And it's even worse when you remember Robert Mueller gave Bill Barr summaries, 7-page summaries that Mueller had already scrubbed. Bill Barr could have put those out day one. So it's just a reminder of how manipulative and dishonest he was. And honestly, I think he saved President Trump's hide on that.
Well, and on that particular front, President Trump seemed to be very good, as we know, with Bill Barr's help, at least as the book lays out, that he was able to turn a lot of these controversies on their head and create them as weapons. So the Mueller report became the fake Russiagate witch hunt, and he used that in campaign rallies and slogans to raise money and so on and so forth. And so to borrow your some of your prosecutorial anecdotes, use a lot of mobster metaphors. If Trump is the head of the family, where does Barr fit into this metaphor and why?
He's got to be the consigliere. I mean, it's so on point, but the consigliere is the counsel, I guess it sort of translate as, and sort of an enforcer as well, because he does more than just give Trump advice. He carries out some of the dirtiest deeds than Trump has for him. And the thing is, there are many instances where Barr did something that was overtly political, but then he said, I never spoke with the president about it. And it's like, right, but President Trump is tweeting and you're doing things the very next day. I mean, look at the Roger Stone case, right? So Roger Stone, the sentencing recommendation comes out from the line prosecutors, the people who tried and convicted Roger Stone, fully approved all the way as high as they had to go in the Justice Department up to the U.S. attorney. That night, Donald Trump tweets, this is an outrage. This is a miscarriage of justice. And hours later, Bill Barr takes the unprecedented step of undermining his own prosecutors, who then resigned from the case and or from DOJ. And then Bill Barr claimed, I didn't know. I never saw the president's tweet. I mean, I'm dubious. I can't disprove that, but I'm very dubious of it. So like the best mob bosses, Donald Trump doesn't always have to call people in and say, hey, this is how I'd like you to do things. There's an understanding. They get into a flow. There are instances where there are explicit sort of coordination between the two. But I think that's the closest analogy I can make there to the mob world, with their relationship.
No, of course. And so one of the things, all right, I don't want to give away too much of the book. So I'm going to stop pulling from too many excerpts. But one of the things, I'm going to go big picture here, because again, part of why I liked this book so much is that you see a lot of the real world, the current news cycle, the current world in the time capsule of the Bill Barr reign as Attorney General during the Trump years. And one of the more pertinent news stories that's come out, I'm imagining since you wrote this book, was as part of the E. Jean Carroll saga. So E. Jean Carroll, she accused President Trump of rape in the 90s, but more pertinently accused him of defamation in 2019. This was during his administration. And there was a question over whether that defense would still hold up even though President Trump was out of office and a new administration was coming in. Even though a federal court said, you know what, this is essentially bogus, the Merrick Garland administration said, well, because this happened during Trump's administration, we are going to take this up as the Biden administration defending President Trump. What does that say to you?
So I've been critical of Merrick Garland for this decision. I've praised Merrick Garland for some other things that I think are important, but this I disagreed with. So I'm very critical in the book. So Bill Barr's determination, when Donald Trump came over to the Justice Department, said, I'd like you to represent me on this matter. I'm being sued by AEG and Carroll for defamation. The determination for Bill Barr was the conduct in the official course of the president's duties. The way it was explained to me as a prosecutor is if you get sued for something you do as a prosecutor, because you indicted somebody because of something you said in court, you'll be covered by DOJ. But if you get in a bar fight or something, you won't be covered by DOJ, right? Inside the job or outside the job. And Bill Barr looked at that and determined that Donald Trump's comments about E.G. and Carroll, the allegedly defamatory comments, that's within the scope of the presidency. And I was very outspoken at the time that that was absolutely wrong, that while the president has a very, very broad job description, that can't be part of it. I felt vindicated a couple of weeks or months later when a federal judge in the SDNY, Lewis Kaplan, who I appeared in front of, brilliant guy, took the same position. He said, no, DOJ, you can't do this case because it can't possibly be within the scope of the presidency to defame somebody who has accused you of sexual assault. Under Barr, DOJ then appealed. Now, the appeal's still going when Merrick Garland comes in just recently, and Merrick Garland decides we're going to continue this appeal. We're going to keep fighting this. I think it was wrong on the law. I also think Merrick Garland missed an opportunity there to say, we're different. We're not doing things this way. We're not stretching the law to this preposterous extreme just in order to protect Donald Trump. What I think Merrick Garland was doing there and has done in a few other decisions is he seems to be searching for the path of least resistance, the path of least political turbulence, because I think his approach to setting DOJ back on its path is to make as few waves as possible, pick as few fights as possible. I think that's a mistake. I think he needs to more affirmatively and aggressively undo some of the ones that he can. Not all of them can be undone, but to undo some of the worst abuses of the Barr administration. So I disagree, and we'll see how it comes out on appeal, but I think it's a missed opportunity by Merrick Garland.
Yeah, I saw that you put out, right basically after that, I believe it was an op-ed, maybe within hours of that decision.
I think so.
All right, Ellie's on it as usual. Great.
Yeah.
Good to go.
Yeah.
And so one of the other things I wanted to ask about is I'm fascinated with this concept of an end game, right? And we've seen it with multiple other Trump administration officials, either toward their end of their time in the administration or after they resign, they say, you know what, all along I was not game and I pushed internally, you just didn't see it. And one of the interesting things is that after President Trump lost the election and it was clear that he had lost, especially in the weeks after, it seemed that Bill Barr was changing his tune a little bit, wasn't quite going along with the president on every decision, or at least what he had set precedents of over the course of the administration. And specifically, we've spoken about Bill Barr being in the news. He was recently in that Atlantic article where he was quoted saying, you know what, I had suspicions all along that Donald Trump's claims of voter fraud were, quote, bullshit, despite acting the opposite leading up to that. So my question to you is, you initially, and you wrote in this book that, it's too late for that. Why is it too late? And what can he do, if anything, at this point?
So, I don't criticize everything Bill Barr did in the book. And one of the things I said that he did that was important and the right thing to do was when he finally, belatedly, and we'll get to that, came forward in December 1, I believe, of 2020 and said, we, the Justice Department, have found no evidence of election fraud. But the timing is so important here. This is now 3.5 weeks after the election. It is clear to any rational, sane, non-Rudy Giuliani person that it's over. Bill Barr is certainly smart enough to see that and that his days are numbered and Donald Trump's days are numbered in office. And let's remember a famous quote from Bill Barr, infamous, when he was asked about Michael Flynn, the Michael Flynn case, he said with a sort of sly chuckle, history is written by the winners. Well, by this point, Bill Barr knows he's not a winner. He's not going to be writing that history. And I believe he's trying to salvage any bit of reputation and avoid being sort of lumped in with the Rudy Giulianis, the Sidney Powells, the pillow guy, Mike Lindell, the true loonies. The problem with Bill Barr's little image rehab tour in this article in The Atlantic is they talk about that. And Bill Barr tells this heroic story of standing up to the press. Maybe, I mean, I don't know what happened behind closed doors. The problem is what Bill Barr completely, and the article completely omits, and we can't forget, is that for months leading up to the election, Bill Barr was one of the biggest cheerleaders for the election fraud conspiracy theory. He was one of the biggest spreaders, perpetrators, amplifiers of the big lie. He did it as Attorney General. And I'll give you just quickly, I laid this out. He did an interview with NPR where he talked about the massive threat of fraud. And by the way, I talked before about call and response. This is shortly after Donald Trump started tweeting basically every day about the threat of election fraud. Bill Barr picks it right up. He did this NPR interview talking about the threat, and poor NPR had to run an article shortly after entitled, "We allowed the Attorney General to tell falsehoods on our air." And then they quoted actual experts who said that Bill Barr, the things he was saying were, and I quote, "preposterous, false, and my favorite, they were just nuts." I love that. On NPR, when they're that blunt, I love that. Then he goes in front of Congress, says the same kind of garbage. Congress calls him out. "How do you know this?" And he says, "What's your proof?" He says, "I have none, but it's just common sense." I mean, again, if I made a serious assertion in a court and a judge said, what, how do you know that? And I said, "I don't have any proof, Your Honor. It's just obvious common sense." I mean, I would have been thrown out. And then he came on CNN, Omar, with Wolf Blitzer in September, and was very combative and insisting there's this massive threat and there's nothing we can do about it. And then he told Wolf, "You know, we indicted a case where 1,700 false ballots were recovered in Texas." And I'm watching this going, wow, like, okay, that's substantial. Like, get ready to hear about this. Well, turned out it wasn't DOJ, it was state prosecutors. And it was one ballot, one single fraudulent ballot. And what did DOJ do? They had to walk it back and issue a correction. And you know what they did? This is profile and courage leadership here. Their statement said some low-level staffer got it wrong in a memo. I mean, Bill Barr has a responsibility before you go on Wolf Blitzer to, if it's our case, I mean, any person who wants the real story would say, whose case is it? Get him on the phone. Let me make sure we're, and so those three instances and others, again, like with the Mueller report, first impressions are so powerful, and he's out there using DOJ's seal to fan the flames of this thing. And is it better that he took it back later than if he didn't? Yeah, it is. But he did so much damage with what he did early on that I don't think he can forget. And by the way, we should remind people to post Q&A. If they have questions, post them in the Q&A or the chat. And I think the last 20 minutes or so, we will try to take viewer Q&A.
Yep. We'll open up questions in just about 5 or 6 minutes. So if you have questions, now's the time to put them in. I'm looking at them and we'll start rattling them off when it's time. Right. We've already got some going, which is great.
Oh, good.
And now this one is a little bit more of pushing the ball a little bit forward.
Yeah.
Was obviously one of the major events that I'm sure you would have written about extensively if Barr was still atop the Justice Department, came when on January 6th, on Insurrection Day, at the U.S. Capitol. So obviously we have now seen hundreds of indictments stem from what happened at the Capitol, and blame come from all sides on President Trump and others that were involved that day. Even Bill Barr, of course, at this point, notably after being out of the administration, said of President Trump that he committed a betrayal of his office. But I'm curious, based on everything that you've written, all that you've studied of Bill Barr over the past 4 years, how would an Attorney General, Bill Barr, have handled that day under President Trump?
Wow, that's a great question. So the Attorney General on that day was Jeffrey Rosen, who had been Barr's longtime deputy. Barr, of course, had resigned and left office shortly before Christmas. And Jeffrey Rosen was MIA that day. I can't really speak to what Bill Barr would have done that day, but I think Bill Barr, I give him enough credit for being rational enough and unwilling to cross. He crossed an awful lot of lines that I never thought I would see an Attorney General cross, but he wouldn't cross every line. And I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt and think that he would have done the right thing and certainly not, disappeared. I think an Attorney General has a job in that instance to get in touch with the president and tell him, like a lot of people were urging him to do, you need to issue an unequivocal statement to call this thing off. But look, some of the blame for January 6th sits on Bill Barr. And there's a tendency, I think, to underrate Bill Barr's danger level, because unlike some of the obvious firebrands, the Rudys, the Mo Brookses, the Don Trump Juniors, who were out there yelling to the crowd, Even in other contexts, the Jim Jordans, the Marjorie Taylor Greens, who are very aggressive and in your face. Bill Barr has a soft-spoken manner, right? He looks the part of the sort of veteran lawyer. He's not a fight picker. He's not a bomb thrower. But because he carried the weight of the Justice Department behind what he did, and because he was so devious and sort of did things under the veneer of intellectualism and the law, I argue in the book, a lot of what he did was even more dangerous than some of the sort of unhinged rhetoric you hear from some of the more visible Trump supporters.
No, of course. I mean, he's working, and he actually wielded a position much more powerful than any of the large mouthpieces for President Trump that we've seen. And one of the last questions I want to ask you before we get into these questions here, again, we'll start up the questions after this one, is, look, we have seen the impact of Bill Barr on the Justice Department, but the everlasting question, as many came from the Trump administration, is what sticks from that time versus what was maybe a blip when you look at history. So my question is, how did Bill Barr impact the Justice Department as a whole? Do you think his impact is permanent, or do you think it is already something that, in your view, we're clawing our way out of?
I think it will be long lasting. And one of my hopes and admonitions at the end is that future attorneys general don't look at what Bill Barr did and say, gee, that's not exactly the right way to do things. That's not exactly ethical or moral or proper under sort of prosecutorial principles, but it's easy. And he got away with it for the most part. And it was beneficial to him and it was beneficial to the president. So a lot of what has to happen is we just need better people in these jobs. And one of the things I stress in the book is there's two ways we can look at this. There's the written rules, the policies, right? What are DOJ's internal policies? What do the laws say? And I offer up at the end of the book 9 policy prescriptions or legal things that need to be changed to prevent a future AG from going down the same road and committing some of the same transgressions that Bill Barr commits. But the other thing is DOJ has to get back to what I call the prosecutor's code, meaning all of those unwritten rules, those norms, those ethics that Bill Barr, again, never understood, never learned because he was never a trial prosecutor. And in some instances, you realize that prosecutors, and I was taught this very early and I experienced it, prosecutors are given a staggering amount of power. I mean, when I did my cases, you realize I started when I was 29 years old as a prosecutor, Omar. And at that point, I mean, I was a baby. I had the power to take away liberty from a human being, to by doing that, to destroy families and finances and businesses and relationships. And you learn that when you're in the trenches, when you're going to a sentencing and somebody has their kids there, right? And you realize how much power you have and you learn to respect that and you gain some humility. Bill Barr never had that. He never had to stand face to face with witnesses, with defendants, with lawyers, with judges. And as a result, he approached his job with a real lack of humility. And you realize the only real thing standing between prosecutors and abuse of power, one of the main things, is just the integrity and the principles of the people who have those jobs. One encouraging sign that I'm seeing from the Merrick Garland administration is they do seem to be observing a very strict wall of separation between DOJ and the White House. And I think that's absolutely necessary. And I'll give you one example just recently. The day, maybe a month or so ago, when DOJ did the search warrants on Rudy Giuliani's home, right? There was reporting later that the Biden White House was really ticked off because that night was Biden's first joint address of Congress. They wanted it to be this big moment. And yet a big chunk of the news media was diverted to this sensational raid on Rudy. And when I saw that story, I thought, good. It's exactly how it should be. The last thing DOJ should ever be doing is calling over to the White House and saying, hey guys, we're going to do a big thing today that might take some media attention. Like, are you cool with that? You want us to hold off? And the fact that I was glad to see that the Biden White House was ticked off at that, because that's how it should be. There should be no communication regarding the prosecutorial function of DOJ. So I am encouraged that we're making progress on that level, but we need policy change as well.
Yeah. Now, I want to get into some of the viewer questions here, and don't freak out. I'm just going to use your first name. So if you don't want to even use your first or last name, just put that in the question. But I just do it because I don't want to say, oh, a random user says this. Well, to start, Eleanor, you're going to get us started. They asked Reed, E.G. and Carol, could the AG have decided to continue with this to try to establish the legal limits on how broad the president's responsibilities are, perhaps to lose the case? Is that a legal strategy that makes sense in any part of your prosecutorial strategy?
It's an interesting question, and one that I heard quite a bit. I don't think so. You have a duty as a prosecutor, if you're going to pursue a case, same with any lawyer, to pursue it vigorously. And I think it's unethical of a prosecutor to say, I want to bring this case up so I can lose it. Now, it's possible, a little bit of a variation on that Merrick Garland said, let's get a little bit more definitive guidance from the court, because we have a district court ruling, which is the trial level court. Maybe if we bring it up to the Court of Appeals, we will have a little bit more sort of definitiveness about where that line is and whether this falls on one side of the line or the other. That could have been a motivation of Garland. And I think that's really closer to what Eleanor is asking there. So I think that's possible. What I don't think is the case is the sort of more extreme version of that. I've seen some people posit, oh, Garland's doing this because he wants to lose. He wants to tank the case and get a Second Circuit ruling. If he didn't appeal, the case would be over, and that would be it. And we would have Judge Kaplan's ruling, not as powerful as a Court of Appeals ruling. But yeah, I think that's possible. It's a good thought.
Yeah, and one of the questions I want to go to next is from RJ, who says that Barr, as we both noted, spoke recently to Jonathan Karl over at ABC News, and part of it, that was where those claims about, oh, I didn't think these voter fraud claims were real all along, came about. His question is, why do you believe he is trying to rewrite history? Do you believe he has a future in a future Republican administration?
So I think he's trying to rewrite history because he wants to preserve his reputation, his legacy, his standing in sort of polite society. Bill Barr, by the way, is very image conscious. Don't let him, he puts on this whole, I don't really read the papers, or, he tried when he went during confirmation, he put on this whole, I don't really want this job. No way. There's plenty of evidence out there that he's very image conscious, including from some, I can't really disclose, but folks I know who know him, that he will talk to the media, and he knows about my book, and he is not happy, which I take as a good sign. So if you look at that Atlantic article, it's so one-sided, it leaves out the whole 6 months that Bill Barr was fanning the flames. And as I was reading it the day it came out, I said, oh, this is interesting. And I kept scrolling down going, when's he going to sort of come up with a mealy-mouthed explanation? Well, when I said those things to NPR, when I said those things to Wolf Blitzer, when I said those things to Congress, I really didn't mean this. I really meant it only this narrow way. Or even maybe for him to acknowledge, I said some things beforehand that turned out to be wrong. And when I realized they were wrong, I corrected it. I would have been okay with that. I would have given him at least partial credit for that. It's nowhere to be seen in this article. I don't know how, look, I didn't go to journalism school. I'm not exactly sure how you don't ask him that as the reporter there, but he's presenting us only the little sliver of the story that's good for him. I mean, there's no other reason for him to do this other than trying to preserve his own image. And by the way, one other thing that was missing was the postscript. Bill Barr had his sort of moment of courage finally in December 1, when he said there's no evidence of voter fraud. And then he undercut himself again in his resignation letter, which is this gross sort of fawning ode to Donald Trump and the greatness of Donald Trump. And he goes out of his way to say, dear Mr. President, I've just consulted with you in the White House, and it was a pleasure to advise you that we're still investigating the possibility of election fraud, leaving that door open. That's all he needs. Now Donald Trump will go, no, Bill Barr didn't say there is none. He said they're still looking. They're still looking. So he did him a favor on the way out. He undermined his own one brief moment of courage. So it seems to me very clear that's exactly what if Bill Barr didn't care about his reputation or felt like his record could stand on its own, why would he go out of his way to talk to John Karl? And why would he give us only a very incomplete, similar to what he did with the Mueller report? He took the one sliver that was good for whatever position he wanted, and he ignored and tried to omit the huge body of evidence that went the other way. But the difference is, unlike the Mueller report, when he lied about it, we know the full truth here. He said all those things into a microphone on camera, so we can and should call him out.
Well, and it's followed the pattern of a lot of former Trump officials who, again, either at the end of their tenure or just after they get done, say, you know what, I am going to try and distance myself from this and restart my career. Go for it.
And on the other part of that question, no, I don't think he has any aspirations to work in another administration. I mean, I think he's about 72 years old now, if I'm not mistaken. And he's made a fortune, by the way. We dug this up in our research. He was worth at least $40 million when he became AG the second time. So he's set financially. I think he just wants to save his reputation. Who wouldn't, right? right? I mean, but we don't have to buy it.
Well, and you brought up the fact again that he served under multiple administrations, and one of the questions from Sandra is that Barr was AG under Bush. We heard little, or at least less, about him. Why and how did he change?
Yeah, we heard far less about him, and during his first tenure as AG, he had his major controversy he was involved in was the pardons for the Iran-Contra defendants, which was a bit of foreshadowing, right? Because he helped to let off these people who could have potentially flipped against or harmed the president or vice president in that case. It's interesting. What changed about Barr? So first of all, I think the general tenure of our politics changed in those 25 years between 1993 and 2018. And we went to it with Trumpism to a much more extreme version of protect yourself, attack everyone else, ends justify the means type politics. And I think Barr was on board for that. In the book, I talk about the big question, though, why? Why did Bill Barr want this job? A lot of people ask that, right? He had, as I said, he had plenty of money. He says in his confirmation, he said, I'm semi-retired. I just want to spend time with my grandchildren. And I posit sort of three reasons. One is power. I mean, the man had been out of the public eye and not a politically powerful person for 25 years. It's intoxicating. People want power. There's nothing wrong with that. I tried to get promoted. I did get promoted as a prosecutor. It felt good. I don't have any problem with that. The second, but let's not be misled by his, sort of, I don't need this stuff. I mean, the man sought power and he auditioned for it and he got it. The second thing is Bill Barr has long had an extreme view of the law, what sometimes people call the unitary executive, meaning the president sort of stands alone in our political system. But Bill Barr pushed that so far to the point where he lost constantly in the courts because he was constantly arguing the president is entirely above the law. But he often succeeded in protecting Trump by just going to court and dragging these things out past the election or dragging them out until they sort of went away. And then the third thing, and this was the sort of aha moment that we had in researching this book, Bill Barr is what I call a culture warrior, meaning he is not just a deeply religious person, that's fine, but he saw it as his ultimate goal to bring religiosity back to our government, back to our public life. Now, how do I know that? He gave a little hint of it in a speech he made very late in his tenure as AG this time, and it turned some heads where he was talking about sort of the role of religiosity. But we dug up a bunch of speeches and articles that he had given in the 90s, where he says really shocking and alarming things. And his view is that the only true organizing principle for our laws in our country is religiosity, and not any religiosity, Judeo-Christian religiosity, and secularism, meaning sort of non-religious aspects of government. That's the source of all evil. So Barr wrote in one of his papers about, and I quote, God's law, and he decried, quote, bigotry against Catholics. And he writes this: we are being pushed steadily off the battlefield, or have been for the last few decades. Occasionally, we are jabbing back and poking back as we backpedal off the field. Now, here's the real kicker. What is our larger strategy for preserving the church and seeing it prevail? How will we get on the battlefield? So he viewed this in militaristic terms. The church must prevail. And then he would go on in other writings to rail against what he called social pathologies, including, and I quote, the homosexual movement, which he blamed, and militant secularists, which he blamed for basically all the ills in society: homelessness, depression, mental illness, increase in violence. So the way he viewed it basically is, to quote him again, free government is only suitable and sustainable for a religious people. Again, this is outrageous stuff to bring into your public life. Free government is only suitable and sustainable for religious people. And, quote, Judeo-Christian moral standards are the ultimate utilitarian rules for human conduct. That, to me, is what ultimately drove Bill Barr. He sees this as a battle, his own words, that the church needs to have a strategy for retaking its power away from the secularists, away from the homosexual movement, as he put it, away from the militant secularists. And this is his last shot. And I think he was willing to do anything to make that happen. And I do think it's important to note he is not and never has been a member of Opus Dei. That's a persistent rumor that he's the member of this fringe group. I say in the book that that's not true. He is, however, a true culture warrior.
Well, and tied to that, I think this question goes along well. This question comes from Dorian, who says, in your opinion, what was Barr's motivation for serving as Attorney General under Trump? He'd already served under one administration. Why this one?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and, like we said, he had enough money. There's an interesting question, I think, tied in that. How did he view Donald Trump? And I think he saw Donald, I argue, based on his words and actions, Barr did not see Donald Trump as this sort of wonderful, mystical being to be worshipped, right? The way, I don't know, who are his biggest believers see him. Marjorie Taylor Greene looks at him like he is this, sort of gifted person who we all must follow. And I don't think he viewed him that way. I don't think his actions. I think Bill Barr viewed Donald Trump as a sort of a tool, a vehicle to an ends. I think he recognized that he and Donald Trump shared similar views of how powerful the president should be, right? I mean, he understood Donald Trump wanted to be untouchable and all powerful as president. He was willing and able to make that happen. There was a nice sort of synergy there between Bill Barr's unitary executive views and Donald Trump, who didn't phrase it as academically, but, remember Donald Trump said, we're fighting all the subpoenas and I'm the president. I have our Article 2. I can do whatever I want. Bill Barr recognized, oh, okay, we're sort of simpatico on this, and that he could really implement a lot of his agenda and his personal beliefs through Donald Trump or without Donald Trump interfering. So I think they both sort of viewed each other as a means to an end. Donald Trump looked at Bill Barr as his Roy Cohn because Bill Barr had written that audition memo and said, choose me and I'm going to clear you from Mueller, which is exactly what happened. And that's all Trump cared about. And Barr viewed Trump as a sort of maybe somewhat witting, somewhat unwitting means to Barr's own personal ends.
Well, and I think that relationship was apparent when you go back to what was uncovered, of course, around Ukraine and how Trump viewed Giuliani and Bill Barr almost in a similar grouping.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it says more about either Trump or Barr that he was in a position to be viewed in that manner, or if Trump saw him as someone who would just go along with everything as opposed to just being a personal attorney more than an attorney general.
Yeah, that's certainly how Trump viewed him. I mean, there's that terrible moment for Bill Barr in the call that got Trump impeached with the Ukrainian president, where Trump says a couple of times, I'm going to have my team connect. Rudy and Bill Barr, Rudy and the AG are going to connect you. Now, I say in the book, there's no evidence Bill Barr actually did that, actually got involved in Ukraine, but it's not a good look for the AG when the president just casually thinks of you as like a Rudy on the federal payroll.
Well, of course. And part of that, I think this ties into this question as well, is that obviously there were a lot of things that, not just in your book, but beyond, a lot of situations he was insinuated in, a lot of situations he was actually involved in, and situations that he could have gotten involved in that he didn't. And I think this question from Tina is, when you were writing this book, was Barr given the opportunity while you were writing to comment on this book? Did you reach out to Barr? If not, has he reached out to you directly to express his dismay or otherwise?
I'm really glad that question was asked. So yes, I reached out twice in writing to Bill Barr and his team, and I was forthcoming. And I said, look, I'm writing this book. I said, it's called Hatchet Man, and it's very critical. However, I'd be more than happy to come in and sit down with the then Attorney General and interview him and hear his perspective. And they did not respond either time. I gave him a chance to do that. And by the way, I do want to say this. I think this is important. I say it in the book. I was positive on Bill Barr when his name came out. I was on CNN. Things happen and you're sitting there on set. I was with Brooke Baldwin. I always remember it. And his name came out as the nominee or the person Trump was about to nominate. And they got in my ear, my little, IFB, and said, can you just, in a few minutes, we're going to ask you what you think. And so the name rang a bell. I knew he was somebody in a Bush administration. I did some quick research and saw, he has a pretty good record and reputation. And I said, and I asked a producer at CNN to pull the clip for me because I wanted to quote myself. I said something like, he's a serious person. He's done the job before. He seems well qualified, and I think he's a good pick. Now, a day or two later, we all learned about that audition memo, which I think changed the landscape. But my point is, I did not have it out for this guy. To the contrary, at first, I was willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. And I quote various other people who had been critical of the Trump administration, who originally said he looks like a good pick and then later said he's the worst attorney general we've ever had. So I think that's important. So I absolutely did give Bill Barr an opportunity to come in and speak with me and defend. He could have even issued a statement or just said, I've been a good AG and I disagree with your premise. And no, nobody's reached out to me directly from him or on his behalf. But I do think he's trying to do a little bit of a PR campaign with the Atlantic piece and others. So he had a chance.
And part of what I think is so interesting about all the situations you lay out or remind us of, which it's really hard to keep up when you look back on 4 years of the Trump administration and how many either scandals or controversies seem to bubble up from different parts of the federal government. This question, though, is an interesting one. It's a variation on something I've wondered on as well, in that this is Mark who's asking, what do you think Jeff Sessions would have done, or really my variation is any other attorney general would have done with the Mueller report had he remained as attorney general during that period?
That is a great question. Of course, Jeff Sessions recused himself from Mueller, which is what caused Donald Trump to publicly berate him so badly. But I think let's take any of the 4 AGs I served under: Ashcroft, Alberto Gonzales, Michael Mukasey, all under the Bush administration, then Eric Holder under the Obama administration. Mueller made it so easy. He couldn't have made it easier. Release those Mueller summaries. There's 2 volumes of the Mueller report. Interference by Russia and then obstruction of justice. And at the top of each one, Robert Mueller himself did these 7-page summaries. Here are my findings. And they were already scrubbed for classified information. They were ready to go. In fact, this is like one of these details that you forget about. And when I was doing my research, I said, oh yeah, Robert Mueller wrote a letter to Bill Barr when Bill Barr put out his bogus 4-page letter. And Mueller said, essentially, I think I'm quoting it right, "You've mischaracterized the substance, nature, and conclusions of my report." And then he goes on to say, "I gave you those summaries, Bill Barr. You were supposed to just why wouldn't you just put those out? You could have done those on day one." I think that was so glaringly obvious. And by the way, the detail that I forgot about until I was doing the research is, so Mueller sends this letter to Barr saying, basically, "You've misstated my report." A couple weeks later, Bill Barr testifies in Congress. I remember I went down to DC to help cover this for CNN, but we didn't know about that letter yet. That letter hadn't come out. And a member of Congress, a senator, asks Bill Barr, "Has anyone on the Mueller team expressed any displeasure to you about your 4-page letter?" And Bill Barr just looked right into the camera and leaned right into the mic and said, "Nope." And then the letter came out and he went back in front of Congress and they said, "You lied to us. We asked you if anyone had expressed any displeasure. You got this letter from Mueller." And Barr goes, it's a bunch of gobbledygook. It's this word salad that I quote in the book, but it boiled down to, well, I didn't think Robert Mueller himself counted as a member of Robert Mueller's team. So I was asked about whether anyone on Mueller's team had sent me a letter like this. Robert Mueller did, but he doesn't count as on his team, which is like, come on. I mean, at a certain point, we're allowed to just say, I won't swear, but that's bull. And you wouldn't buy that from your kid if that was your kid's excuse, right? Hey, did anyone in Miss Johnson's class have a problem with your behavior? Nope. Well, wait, but Miss Johnson wrote you a letter. Oh, Miss Johnson doesn't count as part of Miss Johnson's class. You'd be like, get out of here, right? All right, you don't have kids yet, but this will happen to you someday.
I've been around enough kids to know that that's definitely the dynamic.
Yeah.
One of the things I actually wanted to ask, I'll get in a few more questions here before we wrap up, but one of the things I wanted to ask is, one of the things you really hone in on the book is what Bill Barr decides is important to spew to the public. What narrative, whether it's voter fraud or
yes,
law and order or whatever it is, what he decides is important for the Justice Department and for him, and what he decides isn't important. And what I think is interesting is you singled out the case out of Michigan where the people were arrested in the plot to kidnap and potentially even kill Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And you said that was potentially the most significant criminal charge case in his entire tenure as Attorney General, yet he didn't quite capitalize on that reputation-wise.
Yep.
And my question is, were there other ways he could have elevated his name and stood out as an Attorney General, even while still doing what he was doing for Trump?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are 3 things that Bill Barr tried his darndest to never acknowledge or never say or never give any oxygen to. Okay. One was the idea that voter fraud is both, right? We talked about that. He was very big on pumping the voter fraud narrative and shying away from all the evidence that there's really no significant voter fraud. 2 is domestic terrorism, white nationalist terrorism. He bent over backwards at every opportunity to blame Antifa and Black Lives Matter for all the problems. But anytime there was something white nationalists or domestic terrorism, despite all the data, despite all the warnings from the FBI. He refused to publicly acknowledge that. The Michigan case, which was these domestic extremists, the fact that Bill Barr didn't make a peep on that case, any AG would make a statement. If they couldn't go to the press conference, and they should, they would issue a written statement. They would do some strong thing to say, this is a major case that we feel very strongly about, and praise the FBI. He did nothing until we dragged it out of him. CNN said, finally, are you going to make some statement? And through a spokesperson, he gave some sort of boilerplate one sentence of, I condemn what happened. And the third big one is racial disparities in policing. That was a holy crap moment when he was asked by Wolf Blitzer, I believe, do you acknowledge that there is some systemic racism in policing? But Bill Barr just said, no, I don't. I mean, look, that's not a matter of opinion. There's data on that. So those three things, and by the way, what do all three of those things have in common? They were all related directly to common political talking points of Donald, then candidate for re-election, Donald Trump. There's going to be massive voter fraud. Everything's the fault of Antifa or BLM, and there's no racial problems here in the country. And so Bill Barr fell right in line in politicizing those talking points.
Yeah, no, I think it was apparent when you looked at what was focused on versus what wasn't. And I can just say, as someone in the media, you have to do extra digging to find out, okay, what is actually important here?
Yep.
Because usually if you get a statement coming from the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, you're taking it pretty seriously because it is something with usual meat behind it. But yeah, I will admit there was an additional level of scrutiny. Now, the last question, the question I want to end on, I think is a fitting one. This comes from the viewers here. And I'll add on to this question as well. This comes from Ronald, who says, any thoughts about subjects for your next book? And if not, I'll throw one right back in. If not, was there anything that you tried to fit in this book that you couldn't quite get in?
Wow, those are great questions. So first of all, before we conclude, thank you, Omar. You did a great job as always. And thank you to everyone who checked this out. I really appreciate it. I wish we could do this. I used to live in DC, and Politics and Prose. Like I almost felt like walking into a cathedral when I walked in there. The fact that I would ever do an event there is still hard for me to fathom. So was there anything I wanted to fit into this book that I couldn't? No, except the unfortunate physical reality that it had to go to the printer at some point a couple of weeks ago. And I can't tell you how many times I tried. I called HarperCollins. Oh, you got to let me add. Can we add this one thing, this one page? It just happened. And I knew the answer was no. They were like, Elie, it's been printed. It's on paper. But I will have quite a bit of material for the paperback about the stuff that's come out over the last couple of weeks. My next book, I definitely want to do another book. It's exhausting, but it's exhilarating. I think for my next book, I would like to focus on a specific case. I don't know which one, but a big case, criminal case that has sort of been underappreciated in our history. I mean, a great subject that's getting a lot more attention now is the Tulsa massacre, right? That's an example of the kind of thing I'd like to do. Something that was enormously significant, but didn't get enough attention for whatever reason at the time, or maybe even just a case. I don't want to just do like a thriller. I want to do a case with a broader sort of social and public importance. So, but I'm flexible. I can do anything in the law. And I do want to get a little more into reporting. We did a lot of research in this case, but I do want to start working on, the kind of stuff you do, Omar, every day. But I am looking forward to doing another book at some point soon. HarperCollins has standard book stuff. They have the rights to the next book if they want it. So, I'd like to continue writing in the criminal justice field. That's really the field I know best.
Okay, well, great moderating, Omar and Elie. I have the feeling that people will be talking about Bill Barr's tenure as Attorney General for a long time.
Yeah.
And when they do, you've provided a useful account that's detailed, lucid, entertaining, and ultimately quite devastating. So thanks for that. And to everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of Hatchet Man. There they are, multiple copies. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Bradley. Thanks, Omar.
Thanks, guys.